Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. On Monday of this week, we may have seen Rafael Nadal, who won the French Open 14 times, play his last match at Roland Garros. Now, I turned on Tennis Channel, maybe as some of you did, fully expecting that I would see this historic match. Instead, Tennis Channel decided they would run a first round match between Coco Gauff and a challenger. I'll have more to say about that in a second. Now, we did see little glimpses of the Nadal-Zverev match on Monday from Tennis Channel, but most of it was focused on the Coco match and focused on two issues that we've been talking about, which is Coco's forehand, problems with her forehand, and her technique problems on her serve. We haven't talked about that much. But since this all came up this week, the GOAT, Rafa, one of the GOATs, these technique issues that we've been talking about for the last month, I wanted to put out this sort of interim video. I call it more of a foundational video than a movement map video, because we're going to cover a lot of topics, bring in a lot of philosophic sort of dimension to it. I think it's as important, if not more so, than the movement map. So stay tuned here. The whole way Tennis Channel ignored this great champion's history, and maybe his last match on Roland Garros was really quite disappointing. Not only that, but the coverage of Coco's match and her technique flaws was also disappointing. So I want to go into this a little bit more, bring together the threads that we've been talking about over the last month, including this whole underlying process or dynamic of throwing being a foundational piece of the swinging process. So from here we'll go on inside for a little while. Well, now that you see what's up on the slide, you may be laughing, and I can see the LOL post coming, that Kim did a deeper dive than we expected, diving all the way back to the time man first walked erect, which scientists put it about 1.9 million years ago. You may have read a book about this approach in a book called Born to Run, which talked about how humans evolved to become the greatest long-distance runners in the animal kingdom, to chase down game which would become exhausted and overheated. So I call my perspective here born to throw, and also, once you understand the movement principles involved, born to swing. According to the evolutionary biologists like Daniel Lieberman of Harvard, once man began to walk erect, it freed his hands to evolve to throw rocks and spears better. Seems obvious. Throwing rocks and spears at high speed with great accuracy gave us an evolutionary advantage. And so we kept evolving our throwing DNA throughout our hunter-gatherer history, which represents 99.9% of human history. The result is that man became by far the best thrower in the animal kingdom. As you can see here, a great ape is 4 to 6 times stronger than a man, but can only throw wildly at a maximum speed of about 18 miles an hour. A much weaker man can throw 6 times as fast and throw accurately. Baseball pitchers, for example, can throw a strike from 60 feet away and throw it over 105 miles per hour. Why is that? The answer from the scientists about how the human body evolved into man being the greatest thrower in the animal kingdom revolve around 3 central changes to the human body. And I've made reference to these slightly in the past month, and I just wanted to highlight it again, maybe from a higher level perspective. So the first major change that made humans such great throwers is the shoulder complex being so elastic and relaxed compared to other animals. That means that in our coiling and winding that I've described in the kinetic chain, we can store enormous amounts of energy in this whole complex that we can use to deliver speed. The second major change that made man the superior thrower in the animal kingdom is this ability to wind and cock our arm, this sort of spiral staircase move that we have in throwing and swinging. Remember, we talked about this wax off kind of movement and a wax on sort of movement. This is all centrally located in the shoulder complex, where our shoulder joint is the fastest joint in our human body, capable of 7,200 revolutions per second, meaning that for a short time, of course, this interior part of our shoulder complex is going that fast. It then leads to great amount of speed and power in our throwing and in our swinging process. The third evolutionary change to the body happened in the waist area, where most animals don't have that much flexibility and space here in the waist area. Human beings do. And it seems counterintuitive, perhaps, that this could be a source of great power and speed, but it absolutely is. So as we describe the kinetic chain moving up from the ground, once we put power into the ground, it starts to come up in waves. As it reaches past the hips, the lower body, and then passing into the upper body, well, it just doesn't pass there without a rotation of the waist area. So this is where we have the key separation of the upper body from the lower body, so that in all good swings and in all good throwing, there's a substantial separation of the upper torso, how much it rotates versus the hips. And the stretch across and against our hips as we turn back is one of the very most important power sources we have in swinging and throwing. So this relaxed, flexible waist, which basically can twist like a towel might twist in the middle and then suddenly untwist, just sends the energy up the chain that much faster. And this brings us back to what I've been discussing about goat tennis over the last month. Our goal is to help you realize your full potential as an athlete and as a tennis player. We do that by focusing on a better movement map, better principles, and better feels. I've also discussed how the experts on how we realize our full potential, experts like Daniel Coyle, who wrote the Talent Code, say we need an emotional trigger to start the difficult journey to improving, which, if continued, can lead to expert skills and even becoming goat-like. And Coyle says this trigger usually comes in the way of aspiring to be one of the heroes in our life. This is true for everyone, including me, and since I'm the founder of Goat Tennis, I thought I would share a bit of my more personal story and how I arrived at founding this channel. Like most young boys, one of my heroes was my father. He was in the Navy, as you can see here, and he was a good all-around athlete, earning the nickname Twinkle Toes on his baseball team. My father, who grew up in New York in the 1920s, his hero was Babe Ruth, the Sultan of Swat, or swinging. And my father would tell us his stories of Babe and his thunderous home runs and how they were completely different kinds of hits than other players. My other hero was my older brother, Mike, and you can see us sitting here angelically side by side on our first Little League team together. We look fairly innocent here, but we grew up in a lower middle class Irish Catholic family in the 50s, so there was more than a fair amount of sibling rivalry and aggression between my brother and I. I grew up in Sunnyvale, California. This is close by Los Altos Hills, as you can see in the photo on the left. This is David Packard, who is one of the founders of Silicon Valley. This is his apricot orchard, still today. But before it became Silicon Valley, it was Santa Clara Valley, the fruit-growing capital of the world. And we grew up in miles and miles of cherry and apricot orchards. So this aggression I talked about earlier manifests itself in several ways with my brother and I and between my friends. The apricot orchards supplied us with millions of hard green apricots, perfect for throwing at your enemies. So we broke into teams and engaged in roving apricot wars, using the new houses being built as our castles. At the end of one of our battles, you could see hundreds of green apricots scattered over the flooring of these new homes, something I'm sure that the builders didn't appreciate, but we didn't care. But besides these juvenile delinquent throwing activities, I was also deeply involved in all throwing sports, particularly football, where I was always the quarterback in our hundreds of pickup football games. But my athletic and throwing career almost was cut short before it began when I entered junior high school. I wanted to try out to be quarterback for the junior high team, but I got into a fight the very first day we lined up to try out for the team. A boy slapped the books out of my hand while I was standing in line, and naturally, without a second thought, I punched him in the face 3 times. Our football coach was so appalled at this wildly aggressive behavior, he suspended me for 3 weeks. Thereafter, he steadfastly refused to consider my throwing skills for quarterback and assigned me to be an interior lineman, where he thought my wild animalistic behavior could help the team. So while I grew up in a culture of throwing, either punches or football, Rafa Nadal, to bring this story back into focus, grew up like most Europeans in a soccer and kicking culture. He was never a natural thrower, and his serve always gave him problems. At the 2009 US Open, for example, his average first serve speed was only 100 miles an hour, way below the average for the top players of the time. But Rafa followed a very focused path of deliberate practice to improve his serve, and in 2010 he won the US Open with an average first serve speed of 110 miles an hour, so a 10% improvement in 1 year. In his last US Open run, his first serve percentage was 117 miles an hour, almost a 20% improvement over where he began. What can we learn from the goatness of Rafa Nadal? You can see his quotes here after he lost his match to Zverev on Monday. He talked about his passion for sport in general and how he would like to play at Roland Garros again during the Summer Olympic Games in Paris. Which brings us back to the overall themes of throwing and swinging. And here we see a more complete timeline of our evolutionary history from this perspective. In 776 BC, the Greeks celebrated our sporting potential by inventing the Olympic Games. And in the first games, throwing skill, as in the discus and javelin events, were featured. Our throwing skills evolved into a whole host of swinging sports, including tennis, and in the 16th century, rackets were added to our sport. Here you can see the world's oldest tennis court in Scotland, dating back to the 16th century, a court still in use, by the way. And of course, we're going to have the 29th Olympic Games of the modern era in Paris this summer, where maybe, just maybe, Rafa Nadal will once again play in Roland Garros Stadium and compete for an Olympic gold medal in tennis, which would be his second gold medal, having won a gold medal at the 2008 Peking Olympic Games. Now, I do want to take up the technique issues that were hit upon in the Tennis Channel coverage of Coco Gauff. The first issue being this problems that she's having with their topspin forehand, which I've discussed, but I'm going to do it from a slightly different angle. So first of all, the explanation and the criticism from these commentators, most of them who played in the 80s and 90s and used an Eastern forehand grip, is that Coco's Western or semi-Western grip is, quote, too extreme. So this is like these sayings of power starts from the ground up. People just say them. They don't even know what they mean. They don't really explain what they mean. So first, as I said the other day, 80 to 90% of all professional players today use a Western and semi-Western forehand grip for their topspin shots, for their forehand topspin shots. So if 80 to 90% of the best players in the world use a Western and semi-Western, how can you call using an Eastern grip anything but strange and extreme? It's just the opposite of what they say. If you have an argument to make with all the best players in the world for the last 20 years, then you should make that argument. I don't think it can be made effectively. That's exactly why all these players have adopted the Western and semi-Western grip. In terms of the grip, I make the common sense recommendation. Let's do what all the good players in the world do, which is use a Western and semi-Western grip. But again, this is never explained, and I've done it before, but I need to do it again, I think. So if your conception of the swing is a relatively flat, horizontal swinging action, levering like this, then an Eastern forehand grip makes sense. Even if you start low and you're still going like this, that's still a flattish kind of swing. And typically it's coming around the ball, and the swing and gate action is so hard to time just with the arm like this. So on the Eastern grip, the hand, the palm is placed to the side of the racket, and these two fingers, the index finger and thumb, play a dominant role in how this racket is controlled and how it's levered like this. And so this is the problem with using an Eastern grip to do a modern topspin forehand, because you're going to get more of this levering, flat swinging gate action. Instead of keeping the hand to the side of the racket, we want to slide the hand beneath the handle of the racket more to a Western or semi-Western. Semi-Western, padded index finger on the fourth bevel around here, Western on the fifth bevel. Doesn't really matter too much. So what does that do? So instead of having this vertical orientation of the racket in my hand, if I slide my grip down around the bottom, suddenly the racket is more close, which is what we want when we're coming up in the sharply thrown swing plane of a topspin shot. Furthermore, the Western or semi-Western grip removes the dominant influence of the finger and thumb on how we handle the racket and how we swing it. Now the control of the racket goes to the bottom three fingers of the hand. We can basically do all of our swinging even if we don't even use these two fingers. And we really don't that much on a topspin shot. They're there to guide and, absorb a little contact impact, but otherwise they don't play that much of an important role. So now with the control of the racket and the bottom three fingers, we can do much more of the things that we need to do, which is we need to wind this racket into this slotted type of position, coil the hand back, the forearm back, the shoulder complex back that we talked about, storing all this energy. We're not storing any energy if we just stand here to the side and put the racket out here like this. There's nothing being stored. There's no loading, so we can't unload. So this coiling and loading process is facilitated by the Western and semi-Western grip. And so we talked about how we want to throw this racket out on the circle, and we want to keep the head of the racket at the beginning, following the hand behind. We don't want the head to come out too soon. Once the head comes out too soon, we lose all of our energy and timing. We want this racket to be controlled by the pulling motion of the body. That's the governor of the timing and the rotation through the contact, not the arm. Arm alone, which is what happens when you use these other type of grips and you have an arm-centric swing. So a pulling motion, keeping the racket head behind as long as it can, and then as we make this turn, again, finally, to the contact, this is where we get 60% of the speed of the swing, right in here. And this has got to be released in a completely free-flowing manner in a 0.1 second. No time to manipulate, no time to, roll over and twist the racket face and all these other things. It's thrown on the edge right through into this beautiful windshield wiper finish. So Coco Gauff uses a Western or semi-Western grip. I don't really know which, but probably Western. More people are adopting that. So if she has the right grips, according to me anyway, and all the other players, what's wrong with their forehand? Well, this is what's wrong. So in the take back, you can think of the throw as having two phases. There's the external rotation of the shoulder. So if I come close here, see when I rotate this way, my shoulder joint is rotating externally. So I'm taking this back in this wind up that we've been talking about. And then when we throw forward, shoulder joint rotates internally. So externally, internally. That's a basic, accurate, and simplistic idea of the throwing process. So Coco is taking her racket back high, way here. See the shoulders externally rotated back here all the way to the maximum. But what happens is that players have lost confidence in their swinging process, or they're mentally too aggressive at this point. They don't want to go through any transition or sequencing. Remember, a good swing is a sequence swing. It's not load and explode. But Coco is taking her topspin forehand shot back all the way, external rotation, and then from this point, she is driving her body, shoulder, and arm aggressively right to the target, right from back here. And this, see, it opens up the racket out on the swing circle too soon. It starts the rotation, the pronation of the forearm, which we won't talk about too much, but it's going to make the racket tend to come in from the outside in rather than the inside out. And outside in swing path, arm only, will tend to have this racket head getting ahead of the hand. Instead of the hand leading into contact, the racket head like this. The racket tends to flip through too soon, and now the player has a timing issue with how this is going to work, as well as flattening out the swing path. Just by pronating the hand too soon, the racket head comes up behind the ball and flattens out the swing plane through contact. Now we'll cover this in more detail in the next movement map lesson, which will be about the release. But that is the general problem with her forehand. It has the psychological and a technique issue. The psychological, the mental side, is either losing confidence or being overly aggressive from the top. We need this transition move where the arm drops from the external rotation and winds back, still in external rotation in the slot, and then starts to come out of it. Yes, there's a lot of energy in this turn of the body, but this process starts going out in this direction and doesn't turn towards the target till the end in a snapping, whipping fashion. They're snapping and whipping from too far back in the process, back from the slot or no slot at all, and just slamming and exploding from there, rocketing the racket head around the swing circle too soon, out of control. And then all of a sudden, when they realize it's out of control, oh, I'm going to miss it, it suddenly slows down, and then all I can do is just roll the ball over. There's no real good contact. So now on to some thoughts about the problems with Coco's serve, and she does have a major problem. She has served up to 16 double faults in a match this year, and regularly does 10 or more double faults. Against lower level players, like she played on Monday, it's not that critical, but as she moves up and plays better players, it's a huge problem. So what is the issue there? Well, before I get to that, let me just say a few things again about how we just become obsessed with positions in terms of technique, and that's really not the best approach. So on the serve, you see a lot of instruction about, well, what's the best stance for the serve? Is it, a pinpoint stance, or is it a platform stance? And there's infinite number of lessons about this. Again, that's a positioning of the feet issue, just like the grip is just position your hand on the racket this way or that because, well, I've said so. Well, one thing I've never heard anyone explain is why do we have these kind of pinpoint and platform stances to begin with? And why is it, for example, that both those stances, whether it's pinpoint with a back leg coming up, or you start slightly spread apart and you don't move your feet like a platform, both stances are narrower than the width of our shoulders. Why is that? Why don't we start the serve with a wide stance, wider than our shoulders? The answer is that because just like in the topspin forehand, it really has an underlying dynamic of throwing sidearm. The serve has an underlying dynamic of a throw into the air. And so the narrower stance, platform or pinpoint, enables the body to coil, especially the hips, and then the shoulders. Remember, we're going to have separation. And we can do this coiling process with our feet narrow. If we have a wide base like this, see, as soon as I try to turn, everything is locked up. So the stance issue, there are issues there between the two, but the whole thing is not as important as understanding that the serve is a throw into the air. So what is the real issue with Coco's serve, and why is she serving 16 double faults in a match? So and here's how the principles that we've been talking about over the last month can be extrapolated to other strokes. Now, we're not going to go into the serve in any detail here, but I just want to point out to you that the things that you're learning in the topspin forehand, the movement map, the lessons, the feels, the principles, they apply to the other strokes as well. So on the serve, again, we have Coco, and we have a external shoulder wind-up, coil, right? The arm is going back here. We get into a trophy position of some type. Again, this is my shoulders externally rotated at this point. And now I'm gonna arch back, and the racket head's gonna travel behind me from right to left, you know, as I lay back. But all this, as I get to this point in the serve, my shoulder is still externally rotated. Again, just like a throwing action, except we're throwing up into the air. And the same thing and the same problem Coco has on the forehand as she has on her serve. So she gets to this maximum loaded position of the shoulder in the layback position on the serve, and then she gets over anxious. Now she wants to be over aggressive from right at that moment. So from here, she's pulling her body and rotating, firing everything at once, and the arm's coming around too fast. So you see after, and I'll include some links in the notes so you can look for yourself, as she follows through, her body has already fallen off here to the left, and you can see her arm on the left side of her body instead of tucked in here like this. So she also, by firing everything too soon, the arm is coming up too soon. The last drive up into the serve, which again is going to be where 60% of the power and speed comes, and is a pronating rotation of the forearm at this point. If this pronation starts too early, like it does with her, then the racket's going to come flat and down through contact rather than up and through contact. This is going to pull the ball into the net or send it slamming long, which is what happens all the time with her. So it's an out of sequencing problem, getting too aggressive with the hitting side, rotating too quickly out of the full take back, and not letting the body and the sequence develop on its own in this flowing kinetic chain way that we've been talking about on the forehand. And then it becomes an arm-driven swing. So now she's arming the ball. So she's getting up here, and she's a powerful athlete. And she's gonna try to fire this too much. The right side comes through too much, pulling down the path, minimizing the topspin she's getting on her serve, making it that much harder to hit hard and still get it in the court. I hope to do a more thorough, detailed analysis of Coco's strokes later. But for now, we're still on our topspin forehand series, and we're still focusing on the principles of throwing and swinging. And that's been the theme of today, and I hope you don't mind that we covered so many different points, but sometimes we have to stop and sort of bring things together in a high level before we proceed in detail. So I want to end today's lesson focused on honoring Rafa Nadal's heritage and talking just a little bit more about what he can show us about goatness beyond technique. You see his quote in the slide that I put up behind me, where he says, if this was his last match at Roland Garros, he's at peace. So why is he at peace? Is because more than any other player I think that we know, he's given his best at all times. And so he can let go of how many Grand Slams he won or whether he won or lost a little bit better. And so that's the way I would like you to think about GOAT tennis, is that, you know, our real goal is not any specific technique. It's really about realizing your potential as an athlete and a tennis player. And I think that's how Rafa thinks about things, and I hope over time that's how you think about things as well.